there's a handful of NBA players that at one time or another looked like they were on their way to becoming stars. Players that gave people a reason to believe that they would be a star player for years to come. But unfortunately, for one reason or another, weren't able to keep that momentum alive, and for years now have never been able to play at that same level. Which eventually means that there comes a time when you gotta give up on the fact that that'll ever happen. And sadly, I think that's the case for these 8 guys. So let's look at number 1. Number 1, Isaiah Thomas. This really was IT's year to come out and prove himself. After playing at a near MVP level in 2016 and 17, putting up 29 points a game, he injured his hip on March 15th of that year, but decided to play through it. And went on to playing even better in the postseason, leading the Celtics through the playoffs in one of the most memorable playoff runs after his sister passed away, before realizing that his injury was getting worse and decided to sit out on May 20th, 2017. He opted not to have surgery and let it heal naturally, but he didn't realize just how much damage was already done. So after getting traded to the Cavs, he not only didn't play until January, but he got traded again, and in March of 2018, he finally decided to get the surgery. The recovery time was only supposed to be 4 months, and even though the trades and injury caused him to miss out on the max contract he was looking like he was really gonna get, he was still supposed to come out this season and prove that he still deserved it, and prove that he could play at a high level with the Denver Nuggets. Now, it wasn't the best move to sign with Denver because of their loaded roster, but even then, instead of 4 months, it took him nearly a year to make it back onto the court. And he didn't end up playing again until this February, 2 full years after he initially got injured, which took 2 years off the prime of his career. And as of right now, he hasn't played a minute of a game for Denver in the playoffs. Now, there's always next year, but with how bad his injury was, and how he's looked since returning, it's starting to look like that we may never see that 29 point per game MVP candidate Isaiah Thomas again. So it may be time to give up on him. Number 2, Frank Ntilikina. Ntilikina's only 20 years old, but it definitely already looks like it's time to give up on him. And there's not much of an argument besides the fact of how young he is. The man played 2 years overseas, and by 2017 he was hyped up as the best overseas prospect that year. Which really isn't saying much because there were really no other great overseas players that came out of that year's draft. But even though he was ranked so high, it was still a risk taking Frank because teams really hadn't seen too much of his game, and they were basing their opinions off of his 6'6" frame and his potential as a point guard to guard 3 positions on defense is what made teams interested. So who better than the New York Knicks to take a bust like Ntilikina, especially one spot ahead of Dennis Smith Jr. But while no one truly knew what to expect from Frank, they had high expectations for him, and expected him to come out a lot better than he did as a rookie. And then this season was his to make progress and show that he isn't really a bust. But nothing about his game improved, and he only averaged 5 points, 3 assists, and 2 rebounds a game for his 2nd year in a row. So now at only 20 years old, it already looks like it's time to give up on the man because the potential that people thought was there clearly isn't. Number 3, Andrew Wiggins. We're mentioning him for the video, but we're really not going to repeat the reasons that everyone knows of why Wiggins belongs on this list. Number 4, Mike Conley. Alright, don't get me wrong, Mike Conley's a great player and was thought to have been underrated for most of his career. I mean, people always said he should have been an all-star and wasn't getting the credit he deserved. But as good as he's been, he's never taken his game to that next level. And it's about time that we give up on the fact that he will. And at least in my opinion, with the way his career's turned out, I think that proves the fact that he may not have been as underrated as people thought for all these years. I mean, himself, Marc Gasol, and Zach Randolph put together some great playoff runs a few years back, and he's been consistent his entire career, but he's 31 now and coming to an end of his prime. I mean, Damian Lillard was talked about as being underrated, and he's been shutting down those talks. But Conley never had that moment, and at this point, probably never will. We can't blame him for his lack of success in the playoffs, but even personally, he hasn't been a top 10 point guard in a few years, and now he's rarely talked about. Being on a terrible team doesn't help, but you get the point. I think everyone, including the Grizzlies, expected him to break out big one year, but that never really happened. Number 5, Nerlens Noel. Nerlens was heavily predicted to go first overall in 2013, and thankfully he didn't, or he would have gone down as a bust nearly just as much as Anthony Bennett did that year. He was by far the best player in high school the year he graduated, and looked like one of the best college prospects, averaging 10 points, 9 rebounds, and over 4 blocks a game. Scouts still saw his weak offensive game and knew that Noel would never be great on that end, but they still thought he'd make up for it on defense. but neither aspect of his game ever translated to the NBA. Now Nerlens did play solid for Philly in his first 2 years, averaging just about 11 points, 8 rebounds, and 2 steals and blocks a game, before losing his minutes in 2016 and 17 due to Philly also having Joel Embiid and Jahlil Okafor. So he got traded to the Mavs. And even though he battled injuries and only averaged 6 points, 6 rebounds, and 1 block his 1.5 years there, they still believed in the 23-year-old and offered him a 4-year, $70 million contract because they thought he'd develop into a center much like DeAndre Jordan. So I mean, they really believed in him and his ability to develop. But instead, he declined the offer and asked for a max contract. So Mark Cuban and the Mavs immediately pulled out of negotiations, and then the only other offer he got was on a 2-year, $4 million contract from the Thunder. Let's all take a moment of silence for this man's bank account. I mean, that deal from the Mavs is the best deal he's ever gonna get. Because for OKC, he only came off the bench and averaged 4 points, 4 rebounds, and 1 block a game, and his stats and minutes have just been going down every year. And I think it's clear for teams like the Mavs that hadn't given up on him prior to this season, definitely see that it's time to do so. Because I can't ever see him ending up as much more of a player in a role that he had this year. But hopefully he does. Number 6, Dante Exum. Exum was in an almost identical situation to Nitti. He was a 6'6" point guard that hadn't been heard of much until the year before he entered the NBA draft, and then was heavily hyped up because of his size and athleticism for the future. And even then, teams only got to see him play against weaker competition. I mean, draft comparisons even had him compared to Penny Hardaway. Red flags though should have been his 34-inch vertical and his decision to not do shooting drills in some of his workouts for scouts. But teams looked past that and he still went 5th overall to the Jazz. And of course, right away he came into the league and was a disappointment, putting up 5, 2, and 2 in his first 2 years. And then these past 2 years he's dealt with injuries, so not much can be said. But I still think there's no hope left for his offensive game. He has proven to be great on defense though for the Jazz, which is going to make him a highly desired backup point guard, and it definitely hurt Utah not having him in the playoffs this year. But even with his great defense, I don't think Dante's ever going to live up to the hype that he had coming into the league as a 5th overall pick. Number 7, Hassan Whiteside. Whiteside went from playing in the D-League and overseas to being one of the NBA's best shot blockers and developing centers within 2 years, when he signed on a near minimum deal with the Heat, and in his second year broke out and put up 14, 11, and almost 4 blocks a game. And the Miami Heat were so impressed that they gave him a 4-year, $98 million contract. And the next season, the team didn't have any regrets because Whiteside did block less shots, but looked better as an overall player, now putting up 17, 14, and 2, and playing a career-high 32 minutes a game, looking like he was becoming one of the better rising big men at the time. But the next season, the Heat would choose to take their team in a different direction, looking to play a faster, small ball style. So they drafted Bam Adebayo and signed Kelly Olynyk, which led to Hassan's minutes taking a big drop to 25 a game, and of course his stats took a hit too. And it's all because he stopped fitting into their system as a player that's great on defending the paint, but can't switch on to perimeter players, and slows down their game on offense when most of his points come from posting up. And the team giving up on him like that really affected him and caused him to lose motivation, get criticized for being lazy, and led to him barely playing in the playoffs that year. And now this season his minutes and stats took another hit, and Bam Adebayo ended up taking his spot as a starter toward the end of the year. He's got a player option for this upcoming season, which I'm sure he'll take to make $27 million next year with Miami, which isn't a good sign for him on the court. So it's definitely time to give up on Hassan Whiteside with the Heat, and maybe in general. The situation clearly affected his confidence and showed that his game doesn't fit with every system. And even after he leaves Miami, I don't think we're ever going to see him living up to the potential that some people thought he had when he first broke out for them. Number 8, Dwight Howard. It's a sad time that officially marks when Dwight Howard should be given up on. After looking back at his Orlando years, it's rough to see what it's come to. He's still only 33, but we've been heading down this path for years. After he left the Magic for the Lakers, the excuse was his back and the fact that he just didn't fit on the team. The excuses ran out though when it didn't work for Houston, and then these past 3 years haven't been any better. He had a bad year for the Hawks, he went to Charlotte, but then people who were just looking at the stat sheet still had hope for him, seeing that he was putting up 16, 12, and nearly 2 blocks a game. There was still a feeling that with the right situation, we could see the old Dwight Howard make somewhat of a return. And then this season started off with him getting injured 9 games in, and being out pretty much the entire year for Washington. and I think this is it for him. A lot of people have turned on him since being on the Magic, but there were still always people with hope he'd make a comeback, or at least convince people that he was still a great player. But he's not great in the locker room, clearly none of his stats help his team win, and I think we can all now finally agree that it's definitely time to give up on him. Especially since he'll be back on the bad Wizards team again next season. Number 9, Kyle Lowry. Kyle Lowry's been an all-star the past 5 seasons, and he's always been a great regular season player, but he's always been terribly inconsistent in the playoffs every single year, this year included, which is why it's time to give up on the fact that his playoff problem will ever be fixed. Him and DeMar shared the same problem when they were teammates, but it's clear that with a new team, DeRozan fixed his on the Spurs. After Kyle Lowry came out this season with Kawhi and looked like a new player, it really looked like that would carry over to the playoffs, but it clearly hasn't. Now, he's never been a high volume scorer, and he still has games where he puts up maybe 15 or 20 on a night, but others where he disappears and either goes scoreless or only scores single digits. Most players step up in the postseason, but this year Lowry's only put up 12 and 5 on 42% shooting and 29% from 3. If the man hasn't changed by now, he's never going to. So I definitely don't think there's much hope left for him or for the rest of the guys on this list. Comment down below who you guys agree or disagree with and anyone I might have missed out on. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and I'll catch you next time.